again. Thanks for having me and asking. I really am thankful that there's been this Moments of Artist Thinking provocations. I appreciate it. I'm going to talk a little bit about the pressure or the kind of consideration of thinking about the impact of work. So I've been trying to think about the work that I've been making over the last decade or so, excuse me, and trying to do that thing that you see, numbers of people affected and impacted, et cetera, and kind of the impossibility of that. With my work, I don't know if that'll come up or not. That's what I think I'm talking about. So here we go. I think through doing and making. My life and practice have always been about mining the personal for something which is relevant outside of my own experience. I've even felt uncomfortable or bad asking for public funding for my artwork, as the making seems so intrinsically connected to figuring out something that I have to figure out anyway. It might be preciousness or sheer arrogance, but I always thought that when things happened to me, I could not be the only person who experienced them. This all kicked off when I was 20 and had cancer in my testicle. Every single person who I spoke to in and around the hospital used the word problematic. Not huge or bumpy or cancerous, but problematic. We should have that problematic growth looked at. I can't say for sure, but it certainly feels problematic. The only thing that I felt was problematic was that some people were talking about my genitals, and me still without a boyfriend. Just joking, it's not a big deal. Instead of freaking out that I had cancer, this would come in the following few days, I just kept thinking, this is so strange that everyone keeps using the same word or words. Like all these people in the world have all learned the exact same language used to describe a cancerous testicle. And then almost immediately after, I thought, other people must also experience this strange world, mustn't they? While I feel alone in my diagnosis, I simply cannot be the only person who notices this strange language. Plus, people must be thinking about these same things, mustn't they? Perhaps it was a fear of being completely alone in a diagnosis of an illness, or some kind of male white privilege that comes from thinking that my experience must be universal. But the hours after diagnosis and the realization that I couldn't be alone in this provided a starting point for years of art making and thinking, and what I hope is a body of performance work which has been meaningful to both myself and others. But I was talking about myself. I had a show, and then I had a sequel to the cancer show, and then I had a second sequel to the cancer show, and I was putting a lot of myself forward. But what kind of personal growth can come about if one just talks about themselves? So I've spent the last year, which is just the projects I want to talk about really quickly, spending this year listening to others and finding a way to listen better and deeper. I wanted to shut up and listen and figure ways for other people's particular stories, their details, which cannot be theirs alone, find connection with others. So I'm going to just talk about three kind of, I don't know what you call them, relational art practice pieces or events or performances. I don't know what I call them. I just call them gigs. So this was, they only exist as documented through images, probably for reasons that you'll understand. So Sex, Cancer, and Cocktails was a party thrown in the front room of people's homes in Manchester and in Brighton. All people there had to answer the sentence. They were free tickets, but people just had to they had to answer the question, what's your relationship to sex or cancer? And then everyone came, like a house party, like an Ann Summers party, or like a Tupperware party, and heard presentations by sexual health doctors, cancer nurses, people with cancer, and sex toy sellers. And the intervention here was to share conversation about pleasure and illness, not fertility and cancer, which there's plenty of Macmillan pamphlets about, but really about what does it mean to feel good and be sick? Or what does it mean to not feel good in a sexual, romantic, or intimate way and be sick? So this was just about kind of facilitating a conversation for others. It's documented with this amazing image from Jason Barker and just audio, which will come out as podcasts. But as you'll probably understand, we didn't want to photograph them, so there's no photographs of these events, which just kind of helped it be really awesome and lovely and quite secret and naughty, and everyone got really drunk. It was great. The next was What the Treat Meant, which actually premiered in Glasgow in March and at Buzzcut Festival, and also ran in London. And this was a conversation for anyone who identified around a stigmatized body. So we asked people what their relationship was to the word stigma and their body, and then we asked them to join us at a spa in their bathing suits, and we would talk about beauty and relaxation for about 3 hours, and it was awesome. Things you can get funding for, it's like lovely. But the question was that this is groups of people for whom the words beauty and relaxation are incredibly unrelaxing and unbeautiful feeling. So we were just talking about those things. Again, it was just a conversation, again, with the drawing. And the final was Cancer Deathmatch, which was at Latitude this past summer, a music festival, which was 6 hours of video game playing between cancer patients and Army veterans. And what we were doing was exploring military metaphors as they relate to cancer and cancer survivorship. Beat it, kill it, fight it, do it for your family, you're an inspiration. We asked audience members, people walking by, if they were an Army veteran or if they ever had cancer. If they said no, which about 90% of them did, I said, great, well then you're cheering. Write down on this paper the stupidest thing you've ever said to someone with an illness, and then use exactly that word only to scream at people who are playing Mortal Kombat against each other. And the more and more people screamed, the more and more they realized how vapid this language is and how much more they could actually invest with them their own self. So, shutting up and listening to people was the best thing that could have ever happened to my practice. Not only because it empowered audiences or provided safe spaces to explore critical issues, which of course is important, but it's not relevant to my practice, but because it helped me grow and pushed me further. And now when I pursue projects which help me sort out my own life, I do it from a more challenging and informed place, and with more people's thoughts and voices in my head. I believe that artistic practice brings topics, issues, struggles, and controversies out of the field of the personal into a space where they can be incorporated into public reflection and hopefully attitudinal or policy changes. And on this question of impact, I think artistic practice can push people to see links and create links that people don't want to see. So the thing I was happy about was that last month I was asked to facilitate a group of young adults. I was 20 myself when I was diagnosed with cancer, and I worked with people around the same age. I facilitated a group of them with a history of cancer and writing workshops and discussions around sex and sexuality. This session, however, was not just for them. It was actually being observed by 3 researchers from the National Institute of Health Research, who were incorporating our discussion into questions for Bright Light, the first ever long-range study of young adults with cancer. So finally, a study on young adults with cancer will, for the first time in history, include questions about sex, which it never has. So even though people have been studying 15 to 25-year-olds for the last however many years, they've never once asked them questions about sex, which I'm really excited about. So I wish I had written a magnificent book about it or launched huge initiatives, but in reality it was all just that I just kept talking about sex and cancer for a long time. And eventually the number of people that were uncomfortable with the topic were eclipsed by the amount of people who thought the topic was necessary and urgent. I still talk about sex and cancer a lot. Changing one study is not really enough for me, and so I'm going to keep talking about it and talking about it and talking about it in time and space where it's appropriate, I think. But just the final thought is just thinking about what I learned about this impact. That if you just keep using your artwork to legitimize your own intellectual and emotional growth and help you sort out your own problems, not only will you one day have a body of work and a happy life with 100% of your problems solved, as I do, but you might also make a serious difference in the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. That was fabulous. Thank you. So it's a real pleasure to introduce our next panel, which is chaired by Emma Nicholson, who's Director of Atlas Arts. And this panel is going to be exploring cross-disciplinary engagement. Thank you, Jane.
Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you to Engage and the conference organisers for arranging this stimulating topic. I'm really pleased to be here. I'm from an island in the far northwest. It's taken about 6 hours today to get here, so I'm going to keep my section very, very short. Our panel are looking at Across and Beyond, an exploration of partnerships and collaborative practice. And we're fortunate to have some speakers whose experience and knowledge will be very wide-ranging and stimulating. The notion of blurring the boundaries and breaking down some of those hard edges between disciplines or sectors is one that's close to my heart. I run an itinerant arts organisation that celebrates, I suppose, the specificity of place, where we have no walls, and our programme works with many of the kind of forces, if you like, within our local community and manifests through commissions, exhibitions, exchanges, and different projects. So our panel today, we're offered 3 questions for contemplation and stimulation in preparation for their talks, and I'm going to let you know what they were. How can partnerships create a level playing field for exchange and develop big relationships built on trust and openness? What is the value to creative and professional working practice of cross-disciplinary engagement? What can be learned from working in different mediums and different fields? Does cross-disciplinary engagement help to open up and expand access for young people to wider spheres of cultural production, and why is this important? So I'd like to introduce our speakers, who represent, in a way, 3 different scales of inquiry into this cross-disciplinary working. In the order that they're speaking, Pat Cochrane, who is the founder, chief executive of CAPE UK, works with policy and delivery, and Pat's presentation will explore her work, and how it relates to action-based research, along with the value of cross-disciplinary working to inspire inquiry, creativity, and learning. Secondly, we have Jessica Goggin, who is an independent curator and educator based in Brazil and director of the Instituto Mesa de Rio in Rio de Janeiro. Jessica is going to elaborate on a fascinating project called the Contemporary Laboratory, Proposals and Discoveries of What Art Is or Could Be. And thirdly, we have a duo, Kate Gray, who is CEO and artistic director of the collective in Edinburgh, and Ross Sinclair, an artist, musician, writer, and teacher. And they will be discussing Ross's installation and extended project, 20 Years of Real Life, which included a year-long engagement program, Free Instruments for Teenagers. Now, as you know, Engage is very strict with the timekeeping, so you can all look at your watches and start tapping when the 10 minutes is up for Pat.
I had that kind of panic when Emma was saying what we were supposed to be talking about. It was that kind of exam panic. Oh my God, am I going to answer that question? I'm not sure if I am, but I'll give it a go. The last few weeks have been pretty shattering, haven't they, in the world? I had a friend who was in Ankara, 10 minutes away from the demonstration. I have friends who live in that bit of Paris. I have friends who are living in Beirut. The world is incredibly complicated and challenging, and I spent part of the weekend driving down to see my very elderly mother. Literature is keeping her going. And I was thinking, what am I doing with my life? Am I doing something worthwhile? Am I doing something that's really that's engaging with all these massive issues? And I thought, yes, I am. Because the arts, more than any other experience that children have, gives them an opportunity to make sense of all the complexities and uncertainties and difficulties, can I use that word, that they're facing. So a huge amount of unknown. So what I've been doing for 20 years is working around supporting and developing programs where artists and arts organisations can work with other organisations. And the reason I think that's important, and it concentrates the mind, I got some statistics. At the moment I'm involved with, Cape UK is the bridge organisation for Yorkshire and the Humber. There are 1.25 children and young people that live in Yorkshire and the Humber. There are 2,500 schools, and there are 150 funded arts organisations. And, you don't have to be a mathematical genius to work out that a lot of the arts experience that children are going to be able to access will be through schools. So I know that was part of last session's discussion, but I think it's really, really important. But the challenge that we face is that more and more we're asked to justify the arts through a whole set of criteria that we don't necessarily want to play with. So raise academic standards, motivate the disengaged, turn around children with challenged lives. We've all, I suspect, nearly everybody in this room has written a funding bid to say that we will do that. But I want to say today that I think that if we frame it right, and if we shape those partnerships effectively, it's almost its own art form. It draws on a range of really sophisticated skills. So over the years, we've worked with hundreds of schools around creative partnerships. We managed a national programme for creative partnerships, worked with over 600 schools around inquiry. And most recently, we've been working with a number of the other bridge organisations in England, I can't say the UK, in England, around a programme called Strong Voices. And most of what I'm going to say is drawn from all of those projects, but it's going to specifically focus on Strong Voices. So we were collectively trying to engage with how arts and cultural organisations could work with was it the 6%? The 6% of most vulnerable children and young people in England. And we worked, there were literally hundreds of projects and programs, and I can only give you a tiny snippet of what happened. So one very large music venue completely changed their programs so that young people were working as apprentices within the program, young people with learning difficulties, and it changed the way the organisation thought about how they ran programs. Another one worked with a centre, youth centre, where young people had severe mental health issues and were coming in for individual counselling sessions, and a slow and developmental work with an artist worked out ways in which those young people could work collaboratively to express themselves and to understand what was going on in their lives. I'm not doing these projects for the right service at all, because that's not what I've been asked to do. So what did we find? There was a real importance for different worlds to come together and try and develop a shared language. And in a way, this diagram doesn't work very well, because the interesting bit is the bit in the middle. So people come from their own professional practices with a whole set of orientations and ideas about what is good and what's important. So this is a gross simplification, but youth workers tended to think it was great if children actually turned up. They would adapt their programs for the young people. It was a drop-in, you don't have to be consistent. But their main objective was to focus on outcomes for the children and young people, for their development, for their confidence and so on. The arts and cultural organisations tended to focus on, we'll give them a programme, we need an ongoing commitment, we know about the art form, we're going to share that. And they tended to measure their achievement by the actual output. And the interesting stuff was the stuff in the middle, the shared space and the shared languages that started developing about what it really is that we wanted to focus on. We, at CAPE, we were responsible for facilitating an action research process, which was really just supporting people to say, what is it you want to achieve in this programme? What do you want to try and change? What do you want to influence? And it's always very difficult to have a diagram about action research, because you decide on a thing you want to change, then it moves and changes and you decide to look at something else. But what we found was that the process of actually focusing on a shared set of purposes and having discipline about coming back and reflecting and observing and thinking about what had happened led to some very interesting change and development. I think one of the things that's really important is that action research is frequently used as it's become a bit of a buzzword in our sector, but it does require a supported process. It's not just a question of thinking, right, we're going to turn around these children, we're going to paint a mural, and they're going to be confident at the end of it. It's a more complex, nuanced process than that. And we did collectively some work on how can you do that in an interesting way so that all the practitioners are really part of those conversations. And it was teachers, artists, youth workers, community workers, social workers working together to really share those questions. So, what did we learn? I think the most important thing we learned is that the youth and community sector, so the sector whose job it is to work with some of the most vulnerable young people, are completely fed up with arts and cultural organisations coming to them and saying, we've got money to work with your kids. We've written a funding bid and we're going to turn around their lives through the arts or through drama or whatever. They're pretty pissed off. So they're the people who are doing the consistent work with those young people. They're often the people who are doing the real tough work. And I think we've got to work out a way of working collaboratively with them. So the main things that emerged were, it's absolutely critical to create a shared space for collaboration that's supported by reflection. Reflection is the grit in the oyster. That you need to hold that space, that the sort of the busyness of project delivery means that often gets shoved out of the way. But it's really, really important. And you need to cherish the ability to sit with uncertainty. That's integral to good developmental arts processes, isn't it? The other thing that's probably critical is that you can't do this work by negotiating programs with senior people and then letting the deliverers get on with it. Everybody's got to be involved. I've been told I've got to stop now. I think just one final thing is that we're not trying to turn arts practitioners into teachers or youth and community workers or vice versa. The critical thing is in the shared space, and it's really important to know the boundaries, so that if you are working, for example, with a young person with mental health issues, that if a challenge arises, you know that you're not necessarily dealing with it. So be clear and assertive about the outcomes that come through the arts process. We don't have to play the game of a narrow game of accreditation. It is possible to really talk about and describe what children and young people get from arts process in a very, very strong and powerful way. And I think as a sector, we've really got to grasp that. Otherwise, we won't influence the wider sector. I'm sorry, I've gone 30 seconds.
Now we have Jessica.
Thank you very much to Engage, and to Alicia for inviting me. I also would like to thank the Edinburgh School of Art and the Sculpture Workshop that's supporting a month's art writing residency, which is why I'm able to be here from Rio. I'm going to be talking about a project called the Contemporary Laboratory, Proposals and Discoveries of What Art Is or Could Be. And it was a lab for young artists from different disciplines. And it was created at the invitation of the Rio de Janeiro-based institution called Casa d'Ars. It's a Latin American art-focused institution, by Instituto Mesa, and Mesa is the organization that I run, and Mesa in Portuguese means table. And it is literally both a metaphor and practice to create encounters between art and society. And for this particular project, we worked with an art collective called Colectivo E, which is a young art collective working with issues of art and education. And the lab was actually inspired by a project that Casa d'Ars is working on as a research initiative, researching the School of Visual Arts in Rio de Janeiro in the late 70s, which is run by an avant-garde artist called Rubens Gershman, and it was a very experimental time. So we were really interested in how we could sort of explore these practices in the 70s and with contemporary contexts and issues, and to turn what might be a poetics of encounter into an encounters of poetics. Casa d'Ars itself was very interested in this idea of a pedagogy of encounter, the notion that you would actually try to live processes as encounters with works, with artists, processes, children, teenagers, educators, contexts, a notion of making with much more than making for, and assuming that risk was something that they were really interested in engaging with. And that was certainly something that the lab pushed in every single direction. The lab comprised of a series of encounters, weekly meetings with invited guests, and also experimental sessions amongst the group themselves. So here we have a series of performances, experimental ideas working in the internal courtyard, playing with some of the ideas of the displacements that were going on in the city at the time. Other examples of experimenting the surroundings, running poetry at the museum entrance, collective experimentations in some of the galleries that were closed off. The encounters were multiple, with Casa d'Ars, with the context, with the history of the 70s, with Gershon, with invited guests, with us as coordinators, but perhaps most of all, it was with the young artists themselves. This is kind of aptly described by Manuel Borja Villar when he says that education is an encounter between someone who knows something and someone who knows something else. A very simple illustration of that was the very first meeting we had when we invited all of the young artists to bring presents. Someone brought a spinning top, the other person brought a torchlight. The encounters were very much also about being the relationships with different practices and different ideas, different artists, different researchers. This is Barbara Zanecki working with them. She's a designer, she's an activist, talking about issues of counterculture in the 70s, talking about timelines and how you would draw a timeline in the present. Very particularly potent because of the issues of protests that had been in Brazil in 2013 that had been very much core to the young artists. Other very different kinds of practices. One, Vivian Kaikouri, was an artist who works with silent walks throughout the city, 8-hour silent walks, and they're walking in through the woods and in the city here. The other image is of Gustav Shiraiko, who's a choreographer and performance artist. We're working with very small gestures and positioning and context in terms of how you relate to specific issues in space. Another set of the notion of those poetics of encounter was also the encounter between the young artists outside of the lab. Here, the two artists creating their own pieces, their own work in different suburbs in Rio. The encounters were very much a space of relationships, as one of the lab participants notes. It was about their own poetics and research, an opportunity to create contexts that in many ways I often call artfully getting out of the way. One of the examples of this kind of set of relationships, this is actually a composite image of all of the astrological charts of all of the young artists and also the coordinators. It's sort of composed together. Another aspect of this notion of the encounter is really important in the sense that we want to kind of look at it to see how might we, in the process of these opportunities, close the distance between discourse and practice, to model new ways of working. The notion of the encuentro, coming from Latin American feminism, is an opportunity to think through how we use these opportunities as a way to refashion and renegotiate identities, discourses, and practices. A very significant aspect and simple manifestation of that was Diana Coker, one of the co-coordinators, was able to bring her young baby son to be part of the process of the course. This meant she was able to work, participate, and also she was breastfeeding, engaging with the group, and kind of creating a sort of new ethical workplace that was kind of like a family. So talking about slowing down attention spans, when you have a baby in the mix, it changes some of the dynamics, but interestingly enough, changed very much the dynamics of the young students, and it had a very interesting impact on their way of working and how we were working together. But encounters are also the notions of obstacles, coming against difficulties, trying to negotiate ideas and possibilities. There's a very nice essay by Janusz, who's a Polish artist and educator, talking about the art of the encounter, and he uses different dictionary definitions of the encounter to really explore different ways of thinking about the notion of the art of the encounter. And so one of those obstacles was, of course, the institution itself. Casa Daras was opened in 2013. It's was funded by Daras Latin America, and was to be a kind of regional center for Latin American art. So it has very specific sets of contexts and rules and discussions and issues. But curiously enough, one of the things that turned out to be the most potent in the mix was actually a traffic island that sat 20 feet outside of the institution's gates. The island, as a kind of literal and symbolic theme, became very potent throughout the context of our discussions and notions of what it meant and what might we think about in contemporary society in terms of the notion of the island. And it informed a lot of the work we did. One of the events that we produced was this notion of a spectacle conference. The spectacle conference was inspired by this idea of combining performance and classes in the 1970s at the School of Visual Arts. And so what they were interested in was creating an anti-spectacle, a series of micro-performances like mini islands that were interconnected. So olha, imagina, escuta, sente is look, imagine, listen, feel. So they turned the traffic island into a literal island. Here it's turned into a tropical beach, kind of playing with this idea of different ways. We had some audience members that decided to enjoy the experience. The theme of the island also comes up again in relationship to technology, and one of the artists wanted to use the time period to invite people to deactivate their Facebook pages. Performance contexts both in different ways, relational close, working with the street protests and bringing those projections into the institution, collective movement. And also a small exhibition, which was not necessarily planned, but evolved through the process, working with the closed gallery space that we had working with. We ended up having videos of the encounters, some videos the artists had produced, a small kind of timeline looking at the process over the several months that we've been working together, artist books of email exchanges, Facebook pages, artist drawings, various different opportunities, interestingly enough, as Pat was just talking about, embedded opportunities to reflect on the experience. So there's a notion that both it's programmatic and reflective simultaneously. And this material was put together in the context of a case study that's published in Vish the Mesa, which is the organization I run their magazine, and it's a bilingual magazine. And it was also an opportunity for the students themselves to become part of a kind of editorial committee that informed aspects of what was going to go into this exhibition and what would be part of it. So in terms of kind of what is transpiring, you know, the artists, after the laboratory, formed their own collective. Various different people have gone into advanced art programs. There's various different small-scale exhibitions that different people have done. There's very strong relationships that have been developed, and I think one of the things that's been really radical and important is, particularly because Casa d'Ars is a strong institution, is actually about to close. And so this incredible fragility of institutions in Latin America is sort of really significant. So one of the things that they really need to work with and think through is their own relationships with themselves and how to give tools to build those different kind of contexts that can help them think through certain issues and ourselves within that. This is a poem by one of the students. A collective body born from many hands, heads, legs, hips, hearts, a body of the encounter, in the uncertain process, each moment a step, each step a challenge, anxieties, amenities, all ages, young babies old, together breaking the automaticness of adulthood. A collective body produced in and by difference, a body of spells, songs, shelters, so much, unlikely junction, cosmic mixture. A collective body suffices. In the presence that talks in the silence, understood in the gaze, a body of experience, strange, familiar, still, and always unfolding. Thank you.
And now we have Kate Gray and Ross Sinclair.
Hello, I'm Kate.
And I'm Ross.
So I'm just going to give you a bit of context about Collective, because this is where the project took place. And the name Collective came from a name it was given, and it was first constituted 30 years ago as an artist-run space. We like to think of ourselves as an artist-run space that's constantly growing up. But we are actually in the middle of quite a large transition ourselves. This is where we are at the moment. The white building on the right-hand side there are our offices and a sort of small exhibition space. And the large dome, green dome on the right-hand side also is where the exhibition, which kind of launched the project that we're talking about, took place. So the whole walled site is apparently going to change over the next few years. And our project within those walls our mission is to bring people together around the production of new work. So everything that we do stems from artist practice, and we try and follow their practice or their question to a conclusion of some kind. But sometimes we start with a conclusion and expand out from that. So our vision, I'll go back, because this site is actually the City Observatory. So we're repurposing this whole walled site to become a new kind of city observatory for the city of Edinburgh. And you can't see the view from here, but if you looked from the white building off towards the left there, that would be the iconic view of Edinburgh that you see behind a Newsnight image. When you see the castle in the distance through the Dugald Stewart Monument. So we're very much in parallel with that space and we're inhabiting a very different kind of space and repurposing it. So we want to be a new kind of city observatory that repurposes old structures to create new ones. It's actually, by a quirk of Scottish law, the site is a legal commons. So we're really interested in how we can activate that and think about observation in its widest sense and what the visual arts can do for observation and what observation can do for the visual arts. The actual park that it's situated in has an incredible history, which there's no time to go into right now, but you could find out about if you like. But we try and learn about it with learning and unlearning with artists and how they involve people in those processes. The site's never been opened before, so this is an architect's vision of what the site will look like in 2017. So, over to Ross.
Okay, I got the sort of timing wrong on this, so I've got 150 slides, so I think they're on for like 2 seconds each. So, okay, so the project that we worked on together is called 20 Years of Real Life, Free Instruments for Teenagers. I should also say, maybe before I start, I also work at Glasgow School of Art up the road. I'm a reader in contemporary art practice. I made that up myself, I still don't know what it means, but it seems there's been a bit of a thing about today organised sort of education, informal education, so I thought I should put my hand up and say that. And we're way behind already, so that's good. So anyway, I'll just kind of go through this. In 1994, I had the words real life tattooed on my back, and since then I've explored how the ideas surrounding an understanding of this paradigm could be interrogated through a series of artworks, exhibitions, installation projects, different events. These works have often utilised performance and music amongst a diverse variety of forms and have explored many different contexts, galleries, museums, public spaces, etc. I've shown these projects widely, nationally, internationally, but the key element of a lot of these works has been engagement with the viewer, with audiences, with a public, establishing some kind of dialogue, attempting to enter into some mode of critical thinking. And more recently, some of the projects I've made have more directly involved the viewer, the audience, this public, whoever they are, in participating in the work, sometimes in a more direct manner. So this 20 Years of Real Life project began with me thinking back over these 2 decades of this project I've been working on and considering how I might mark the anniversary. So I wasn't interested in making a traditional retrospective of reconstituted works, and instead began to develop a project that would celebrate the spirit and ambition of this project, well, as I saw it anyway, but turned around to face the future in a positive, dynamic manner. I discussed and developed this with Collective over a series of visits and meetings, a lot of discussion in 2013, early 2014. And through this kind of process, this dialogue, we developed the exhibition in the City Dome. So we set up within that, which you can sort of see now, 2 spaces where visitors could play music in a traditional sort of band rehearsal setup, and also could paint placards and kind of have their say, paint what they think, which were then stayed in the space as well. So in my mind, I was celebrating each year of this real life project, flagging one work made from each year, and I made that into a sort of placard and had that piled up in the space, and then we translated that into a musical instrument that we'd set up all together, stacked up in the space. So, and because it's my background and I'm interested in it, I chose a traditional band setup of drums, bass guitar, PA system with additional amplifiers, cabling, and ancillary equipment required to make 5 full band setups. So the whole process of it was really important to me, and working with Kate and the other folk in the gallery, and particularly because the City Dome, as you see, it's not really a white cube gallery, it's not at all a white cube gallery space, so that was part of my thought in the beginning, that this could be a space where something else could happen, that there could be a more sort of dynamic interface. And Carlton Hill, for any of you who know, it's a massive sort of tourist area, and Collective had moved from Coburn Street, where they'd been, even with the glass window, was still sort of, a wee bit impenetrable sometimes, just as all kind of art spaces are. So I really like this new kind of openness. Oh my God, that wasn't in it, so that's about 30 seconds extra. So I had the idea from the beginning that we'd give away all the musical gear to anyone interested in making a new band, the stipulation being that they all had to be born since I had this tattoo made in 1994. Born after. So i.e. there'd be teenagers or younger. So this would simply take the idea of the retrospective and turn it around, transmogrifying the promise of these 20 years of all these real life projects into 20 tangible tools, encouraging the potential creative promise of the future. So the exhibition was really well attended. More than 17,000, it says on your website, visitors came through the door in the summer of 2014. So there were many young people who returned loads of times to the exhibition, and some nascent bands returned to jam repeatedly in the rehearsal space. Many, many placards were painted. They're all sitting in my studio now. At the end of the exhibition, we set up a simple filtering selection process where we asked those interested to send us a short video, not playing, but just telling us why they wanted to get the gear, and then the equipment was duly distributed. So working closely with Collective, we developed a programme, and over the past year continued to engage with these young people through a series of events and workshops, exploring their creative potential through songwriting, mentoring, design, performance, gigs, excursions, recording, and finally making a record, which is what they wanted to do after discussing it with them, rather than websites or SoundCloud stuff or whatever. So we've made the record. This is a cover of it, which is going to be ready in about 2 weeks. So a combination of a couple of my songs and a couple of songs from everybody involved in the project. And we're launching that at Collective on December the 5th with a big gig and a show and a celebration of the whole project. So as much as possible and budget allowing, I've participated in the sessions with them, sometimes leading, sometimes participating, facilitating rather. So it hasn't always been easy. The attendance has ebbed and flowed, exams get in the way, bands break up, the usual teenage stuff. But overall the process has been very positive and encouraging. And from the beginning, it was very clear in my mind that the whole process of the project, from beginning to end, all the elements together constituted an artwork, and rather than an outreach project or something bolted onto the show. So in early discussions through to the development, the construction of the show, working with all the guys over the year, the first time I met them, I told them this was going to be an artwork and they were participating in it, and there'd be a result at the end of it, and they'd get the free gear and there'd be access to all these things. That was, so of course I consider them to be participants, or perhaps collaborators rather, working with me to create the artwork that, and then will provide them with a lot of positive experiences and a whole bunch of records featuring their music to distribute as they see fit. The record with the gatefold cover and insert booklet in green vinyl serves both as a live currency in terms of a representation of their music at this time in the usual way, but additionally I think has a longer shelf life as a document of the artwork, marking the long process of the project that can be subsequently identified and perhaps discussed as one model of a kind of practice. And very quickly, I'll just read a quick quote from the inside of the gatefold sleeve. Okay, 2014 was the 20th anniversary of my real life project. I wanted to look back and celebrate the journey, but at the same time look towards the next 20 years with a renewed sense of optimism. What had been promised, what had been achieved, hundreds of exhibitions and artworks, local, national, international, books and essays to document them all, records, CDs, posters, postcards, beer mats, billboards and any other forms I could think of to use. But what really remained when the show was over and the people went home? I wanted to explore a way to translate this energy, ambition and hope of these works I'd made, many of which of course were only live for a few weeks or months perhaps during an exhibition, into other forms, planting new seeds that could take on a real life of their own. Collective asked me to make an exhibition in the City Dome. This was the perfect opportunity to reach out to another audience. Thank you, Kate.
And I thought it would be also useful to know that this project came out of a generation project that you've heard about before today, and you know that meant that we were working in a slightly different way than we would have been generally, but it was also around this sort of relatively arbitrary sort of dates of this generation that was being celebrated, and although dates always have to be taken into account, we just thought that 20 years of another kind of marking of time was interesting.
But it's also 30 years of Collective.
And it was 30 years of Collective, and so there were all these sort of dates sort of confusing the original date to some extent. And also that out of this project, because it's in parallel, I mean, I think you get the idea that these things are lots of things happening in parallel and converging at different times. And some of the other projects that we're involved in, from these projects, we are hoping to evolve a young unboard board. And we did work with Cangate Youth a lot as well.
Yeah, just in the last week I've just been finalising all the kind of the booklet that's going to, we've got a sort of 20-page booklet that goes inside the album. 0 minutes. So I've kind of thought a lot about how the thing ties up in the end, and I think, you know, the Canongate Youth project where a lot of the guys were rehearsing and recorded, and it's made me think that actually us doing the project with the kids is one thing, and the basic thing for me was this thing about tools. They all get a free guitar or whatever, and an amp and all that, but it's actually a lot of the kind of plugging into the other people that we worked with along the way that actually is the sort of thing that somebody mentioned, that is this kind of hinterland or, you know, constituency that they can return to. You know, at Canongate you can go and rehearse on a Friday afternoon, it only costs £1 or whatever, it's really cheap. So these are the kind of things that they've got plugged into that actually can help support them into the future, and there's some of the positive spin-offs from the project. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much to all our speakers. Now we have 5 minutes of conversation up here at the table, and then 15 minutes for all of you to consider the presentations and 10 minutes to have further conversation. I was initially going to ask this question directly to you, Pat, but I think I'm going to open it up to all of you in a way, because I think it's apparent through the very different approaches that have been presented here that you're all kind of key roles in facilitating, in making that cross-disciplinary activity happen. And, you know, Pat, you're facilitating those relationships across disciplines, and Kate setting up the framework for, if you like, for Ross to engage with young people through his project, and Jessica, you're, you know, integral to the development of the lab as well. And I wondered if perhaps you could, returning to the questions that we were invited to consider, talk about how you create that kind of level playing field and your different roles in the work that you do.
Well, can I, yeah, I'm not sure. We try always to start programs bringing together people from different worlds into a safe space where there's a really comfortable and open but also challenging space for them to have a dialogue. And we've learnt over the years that it's important to trust the process. So we open up the space for exploration, and it's often playful exploration. We set up kind of collaborative processes, but basically we've just learnt to trust the creative process, and people will have a good dialogue. I mean, it was very interesting reading some of the work on Jessica's website, the sort of texts about dialogue, communication, safe spaces, listening, and so on. It works.
Yeah, I think that you really have to model that. I think that it has to be kind of inherent to how you work in a mode of dialogue and sharing. And so that has to be built through trust and needing to be able to kind of, I think it's interesting because it's not only about, for want of a better word, the sort of coordinators assuming risk. You know, one of the things that was very interesting in our process is just how often we needed to kind of reassert that they were kind of driving the ship in terms of how they were going to sort of develop different ideas and processes. So they also needed to assume the risk too.
Absolutely. You've talked before about that enabling the risk. I might come back to you on that.
In strict order. I think for us, it's not really a conscious decision to facilitate different disciplines to get together. However, that's often definitely what happens. But I mean, I would assume that Ross doesn't see a huge amount of difference between his music practice and his art practice, and I don't think that the young people we were working with had a lot of boundary issues between art and music, and you know, we only have to look specifically in that area. We don't have to look very far to see that a lot of great bands come from art schools, and a lot of musicians paint.
These categories are not...
So I suppose, and also one thing that interests me is not to sort of necessarily expand the boundaries, because a boundary is something that's always has to be patrolled then, and how we're implicated in that then, but more to focus on kind of the connections between things, so that it's not something that, you know, it's obviously always shifting, even if you think about boundaries, but that's not necessarily you know, the most generative thing eventually.
Can we let Ross say something?
Well, I mean, just briefly, I can't really remember what the question was even, but...
maybe how you related to the
I think
participants
me,
within your
I
work.
mean, the really kind of exciting thing, or, I mean, for me, the whole process, it could have been, I mean, I chose music because in a way it's actually easier than art to kind of as a vehicle, as a sort of universal language, I think anyway. There's less to kind of get through, you know, it's more unconscious almost, and I use that a wee bit in my work as well. But the key thing with it, and this was part of why it's been so great working with Collective, is that the whole sort of relationship and the organisation of it all has been very informal. And I mean, that sounds like sort of nothing, but actually, for me, as I mentioned, working at the art school and being involved in a sort of more formal kind of higher education situation in various ways, it was actually really, I think it's really important that you're working in this process with young people who are also in their own ways plugged into all kinds of education things as well. And, you know, there's no assessment, there's no key stages, there's no kind of nothing apart from, like, you know, trying to kind of play a guitar and write a tune and kind of talk about it and, you know, get that out there and kind of work out how to make it into song and then talk to the guy about how maybe we could record it. And, you know, it's quite organic in that way, and, you know, no one's going to fail. And, you know, it's just, it's about a sort of element of creativity that I think is truly a transferable skill that can be something that you could inculcate into any part of your life, you know, and that's the sort of creative life part of it that I think for me was important.
Okay. Well, that's taken us across and beyond as the topic of our of our presentation, and now over to all of you for 15 minutes to cogitate this this topic and come back to us with some questions.
Hello. We were really interested in the kind of introduction that was set around the current political crisis, sort of social context of sort of the world that we're living in at the moment. And we were talking about how artists, cross-disciplinary artists, would particularly perhaps want to address that in the kind of current climate.
Yeah. Was that a question? Is that?
Yeah, so really, do any of the artists here want to explore what is going on?
I think we've only got one artist on the panel here, but...
Oh, sorry, any of the people representing?
World peace, no problem, we can sort it out.
How would you address it in a cross kind of disciplinary way?
I mean, we supported a project a number of years ago with artists working in schools in the northwest of England, and the way in which they worked with the children was around issues of identity, you know, really enabling children to explore in a positive way their identity wherever they were coming from. The challenge was actually that, which slightly contradicts what I said in my talk, was that some of the teachers were very scared of going too far into that zone, and the artists were really acting as agents of change in that. And it was a very successful programme, and I think it's work that's very valuable. I'm not suggesting that the arts can solve. Sometimes when I say that kind of thing, people think I'm saying, oh, the arts is going to solve it. I'm not really saying that, but I'm saying that and in England this is what's happening, that, you know, science, technology is becoming so prioritised in the curriculum, that where's the space for children to work out the complexity and uncertainties of their development? Where am I from? What's going on in this relationship? Why do I feel like this? There's just no space for that. And the arts, to me, seems like it's the place where that can be explored.
Thank you.
I think in the context of our project, the socio-political context was really important and potent, and not only in terms of what the young artists were bringing in terms of their own lived experience, the political context that was going on in Rio de Janeiro were sort of primed to enter into the Olympics in 2016. There's a lot of different kinds of social questions and displacements going on, questions about investments. They wanted to explore all these different kinds of issues, and it was really important to be able to orchestrate and choreograph a group of different artists and researchers that could bring different kinds of tools and practices to the table so that they could sort of explore and unpick different ways of thinking. You know, the theatre of the oppressed, practice of Auguste Boal, thinking about those kinds of ideas, or thinking about social activism and street design, thinking about sort of various different modes and ways of thinking were really important to sort of bring different kinds of ways of contextualizing the current situation. You know, Refuko was a really amazing young artist who'd done a lot of work in terms of, it had created his own web TV show. He has a whole DIY way of working, and so the very simplicity of his tools and the way he worked was really great in terms of sort of providing these different kinds of opportunities.
I mean, I think there's a sort of there's a kind of limited value in taking your paintings to the barricades or whatever, you know, in that sense. But I think what everybody's kind of talking about here is trying to underpin the value of this sort of creative way of thinking and the value of the arts and humanities more generally in society and in education, to protect that. And in a sense, the job, I think, in some ways, is to build that from the bottom up, so that it's something that's kind of like, that bubbles up through society, for want of a better kind of description, that kind of meets these situations sort of halfway as these things are happening all over the world or whatever, and they filter sort of down into the consciousness of young people, wherever they might be. Then maybe these things are sort of coming up from underneath to kind of counter some of those, the enormity and sheer incomprehensibility of some of those situations.
And I think that some of the things that other people have said earlier, I would reiterate about holding a space where things can happen. And I suppose I often find myself thinking about that as a kind of metaphor of what I do, and and also modelling what you'd like to see, or listening to what other people would like to see and trying to model that.
Thank you, Kate. Is there any other questions from the floor? There's two. We only have a few minutes left.
Hi, sorry, this might be more of a comment. We were talking about the work that's happening being interdisciplinary and connected, and the excitement of art practice when it is interdisciplinary and working with other sectors, and the skills that are being developed through artists and art practice within education, but also within galleries and other sectors, are those development of creativity skills and how they are transferable skills across all sectors, and how artists, along maybe with young people and children, should be represented in all those sectors as well, to have a voice, and how that would empower and bring new questions to those other sectors, because I think artists are very good at asking really interesting questions and then stepping back and facilitating and allowing people to have that space to come up with alternative or other answers. So thanks, that was my comment.
It's interesting, you know, you say that, and it's funny, like, you know, this morning or this afternoon, just sitting listening to everybody talking, you know, there's an extremely dynamic, kind of diverse voices discussing, you know, kind of a lot of kind of complicated and difficult and really positive and dynamic work going on out there. And us sitting in this room feels like, wow, that's loads of stuff happening, really exciting. And there is, obviously. But on the other hand, I think there's the other side of that, which we always have to kind of guard against, I think. And maybe your man this morning was talking about that, where, you know, it seems like even within traditional kind of education systems or whatever, you're consistently fighting a battle for the arts in all these kind of contexts and all these kind of political situations where, unless it's monetized and part of a creative economy and all the rest of it, you know, that doesn't have a value. And exactly the things you're talking about. And again, this morning, these moments of trust and working with young people and sharing experiences and all these things which, you know, can so quickly be turned around in a sort of negative way if someone has some political agenda they want to kind of use against you. And
yeah, and to feed back to that, because I work within arts development, and we always feel like we're banging our head against the brick wall and not being able to access these other conversations and other platforms. But there's a new document that's just come out, which is part of How Good Are Our Schools within Scotland, which has actually got a page about creativity on it. So schools are going to be measured by how creative their schools are, what creative thinking is happening in their schools. And there's one comment which is saying learners are able to challenge the status quo and constructively and generate ideas. So it's about challenging what is going on and what is the norm. So
it's a document in schools.
It's
about to come out.
It's the new How Good Are Our Schools
document. We're getting the flashcards from down below saying...
it's just getting interesting.
So
Zero time.
So I think, there is exciting times, and I think, well, definitely within the Scottish curriculum, we're on the brink of actually, you know, we are still knocking on the doors, but we are on the brink of artists actually being needed in education.
I think we all want to respond to that. It's terrible. Yeah. Can I allow Pat just to respond? Before I allow Pat to respond, I'm so excited to hear that, because where I come from, the local high school has just removed music from the first and second year curriculum entirely. And art is not very well serviced either. So we're going to challenge that.
Can I just very briefly make a quick plug in response to that? The 10th of December, I'm kind of doing a thing at Tramway I've organised for Glasgow School of Art. That's one of these Turner Prize Thursday things where they're doing talks and different things, kind of unpacking the whole sort of things around the Turner Prize. But the one I'm doing is specifically drawing together people from all kind of aspects of sort of pedagogic art education in Glasgow particularly. So there's school teachers, someone from FE, portfolio class, art school, postgrad, PhD, some from Transmission Gallery, to try and at least briefly get people together to try to get a cross-section through that quite opaque sort of journey that young people are making through arts education. So 10th of December, if anyone's still here, come along.
Good.
I think creativity, I've just been doing some work with the British Council, who are developing programmes for teachers around creativity, and it's being picked up all over the world. I hate to say this apart from England, because don't quote me on this. It is not, in other parts of the world, creativity is being seen as an absolutely key part of what people are calling 21st century learning. And Scotland has, I think, really been in the forefront because we were working with the British Council to develop the materials, and I did look on the Scottish Education website and nicked some stuff and put the references on there, so you are in the forefront.
And that's a good note to draw this conversation to a close, and for me to invite you all to join me in thanking Pat, Jessica, Kate and Ross